Hello and welcome back to Life on the Wrist. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be looking at an Omega reference 401.0474, a really beautiful tank style watch manufactured by the brand in 1974. Today's watch collectors are very different than yesterday's collectors. More and more collectors and enthusiasts are going beyond the traditional watches. Round, three-handed watches are desirable, but collectors now go to great lengths to research and enjoy watches that look much different than sort of the traditional pieces. And I think exploring watches of different shapes and sizes has become the staple for many collectors. One brand that dominated the last 100 years of watchmaking was Omega. Omega was a brand steeped in history, or is a brand that is steeped in history, but also in producing a really diverse range of watches. This really came to life in the 1970s when quartz watches became a major part of what consumers were purchasing. This time period forced so many watch brands to innovate, and with that came some incredible designs. This Omega De Ville is a perfect example of what this era was able to produce. The De Ville line of watches was officially launched in 1967 as a standalone line of watches from Omega. In the early 1960s, De Ville watches were seen as part of the Seamaster collection and really gained in popularity, and so Omega eventually dedicated a completely separate line of watches to the De Villes. Omega Speedmasters, Seamasters, and Railmasters are often found as being more collectible by collectors, but the diversity of the De Ville range cannot be understated. Now onto the De Ville reference 511.0474, which is the watch you see in front of you. This reference was launched in 1974 and was originally a ladies' reference. However, the large size of this piece, being 24mm by 45mm, places this watch squarely in the unisex camp of today. Finding this reference appears to be quite rare. There is public information about this reference coming in both stainless steel cases and yellow gold filled cases. This version of the reference was manufactured in the launch year of the reference in 1974. It has a gold-plated tank style case that's in good condition with some signs of wear. The watch case is long with no lugs, as you can see. The lugs basically integrate into the case and has a stainless steel case back. This does sit quite large on the wrist for a tank style watch, being that it's 45mm from top to bottom. As seen on this watch, the dial aperture is smaller, but the bezel, if you want to call it that, of the case takes up a large portion of the top, which is really what your eye focuses on. As I mentioned, the case back is stainless steel, very typical of De Villes. Another really attractive part about this watch is the white dial with Roman numeral hour markers that's in really good condition. The dial is extraordinarily attractive, especially in the dress watch category. Really interesting, the watch comes with a cabochon crown, very similar to what can be seen on Cartier watches that so many collectors have fallen in love with in the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years. The characteristics of this watch truly remind one of the Cartier and Piaget watches that have become incredibly popular by collectors. The classic styling with a bit of edge that the 70s design brings to this watch should not be understated. Yes, this style typically is seen by enthusiasts as something to be worn to dressier events, but more and more one can find these types of watches worn with jeans and a t-shirt, and I think that actually allows these pieces to look really great on the wrist. The watch runs on the caliber 625 manual wind movement. This caliber was launched in 1973 and was produced until 1979. About 2.4 million units of this caliber was manufactured. And these movements, being smaller in size at 7.75 lines, were used heavily in Omega's women's watches. As I mentioned, this reference was originally launched as a lady's watch. The watch has a 42-hour power reserve and oscillates at a frequency of 21,600 VPH. Being produced in 1974, this watch's movement was made in the earlier years of the production of this caliber, being that it was launched in 1973, so it was 1 year after the launch. As I mentioned, not having lugs makes this watch sit a little bit smaller on the wrist, or one would think it sits smaller on the wrist, but being 45 millimeters in diameter, it really is a wonderful size to be worn, and as I mentioned, can be worn in dressier sense, but can also be worn casually as an everyday watch. The craze for watches like this is completely understandable. These watches are interesting in design, beautiful to wear, and so much fun to collect. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this really interesting Omega. It's so funny, you know. I think watch collectors, especially vintage watch enthusiasts, there's really sort of ups and downs with what's considered in fashion, as always, right? Sometimes you're going to be looking at watches of certain complications, certain design, certain brands, and I think obviously the last 3 or 4 years what we've seen is really a push towards watches from brands like Cartier, Piaget, Vacheron Constantin, where you have you know, something that looks a little bit more dressy in its aesthetics, but you're seeing it being worn in settings that are well beyond just that sort of limited range of where those watches can sit. And I think watches like this Omega are a really great example of, I guess, sort of the design aesthetics and sort of the core of what many collectors are looking for. And that is something that looks a little bit dressier, something that you're not going to see on everyone's wrist. And it's one of the reasons why I love vintage watches, because there's so much history of all of these brands, and there's so many years of watch production that you can find some things that are so interesting. And I think this De Ville is a perfect example of it. You know, on researching this watch, as I mentioned before, these are not super common. Obviously, the movement that's in these watches were used heavily by Omega for many of their pieces, but this specific design, you know, you don't really see too much. There are obviously some of these that are manufactured with stainless steel cases. There are some, as I mentioned, that are manufactured like this one with a gold-plated case. But again, if you go to any vintage watch event or any watch event at all, I highly doubt you're going to find someone who's going to be wearing this De Ville on the wrist. Again, such an attractive piece on the wrist, perfect size in my opinion, a really wonderful example, and to be honest, I think a perfect representation of what Omega has done throughout their history, but especially in the 1970s when they were coming up with designs like this, and you know, being able to attract buyers with such a cool case design. And I think even today, many collectors are going to find this an extremely attractive piece. So I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this piece. As I mentioned in the video, there will be an article on lifeandthewrist.com if you want to read more about this piece. It'll be the first link in the description of this video if you want to check it out. There'll also be images of things like the movement and the case back if you want to see those. So then you can see obviously the reference number, the case materials, as well as the movement, which is a really obviously a smaller movement, as I mentioned, but a really beautiful movement with the typical sort of copper tone finishing that Omega used, you know, throughout their history. So be sure to check out the article on lifeandthewrist.com. Let me know what you think about this Omega. I'd love to know if your collecting taste over the last 3 or 4 years have moved into pieces like this. Are you wearing these more and more, or is it sort of not where your collection has evolved? Either way, I'd love to know how your collection has evolved over time. If you are new to Life on the Wrist, be sure to subscribe to this channel and share this video with a friend who might be interested in watches. If you wouldn't mind liking this video, it really does help me out. With that said, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time.